In the heart of a bustling American city, where gentrification has painted over old scars but left the wounds beneath untouched, sits Mitchell's Table, one of those restaurants that exist in the delicate space between aspiration and exclusion. The building itself tells a story. Red brick facade meticulously restored, brass fixtures that gleam under carefully positioned spotlights, and windows that frame diners like living portraits of success. It's the kind of place where reservations are currency, where being seen matters as much as being fed, and where the line between hospitality and gatekeeping blurs with practiced precision. The neighborhood around it pulses with contradictions. Luxury condos tower over family-owned bodegas that have weathered decades of change. Coffee shops with names like Artisan Roastery sit next to barber shops where old men still gather to debate politics and sports. Young professionals in tailored suits navigate around children playing hopscotch on sidewalks their grandparents once walked. It's a place where old money meets new money, where longtime residents watch their community transform, sometimes with pride, sometimes with suspicion, often with both. On this particular Friday evening, the autumn air carries the scent of fallen leaves and the distant promise of rain. The streetlights have just flickered on, casting long shadows that stretch and bend as people hurry past. Outside Mitchell's Table, a small crowd has gathered. The usual mix of hopefuls waiting for cancellations, couples stealing glances through the windows, and passers-by who pause to read the menu posted in its gilt frame. The restaurant's interior is a study in controlled elegance. Soft jazz drifts from hidden speakers, mixing with the gentle clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. The lighting is warm but not dim, designed to flatter faces and make wine glasses sparkle. Each table is set with precision, linen napkins folded just so, water glasses filled to the exact same level, and bread plates positioned at the perfect angle. It's a stage set for the performance of fine dining, where every detail has been choreographed to create an atmosphere of effortless sophistication. The staff moves through this space like dancers who've rehearsed their steps countless times. Servers glide between tables with practiced grace, their movements economical and purposeful. The bartender, a woman with silver-streaked hair and knowing eyes, crafts cocktails with the concentration of an artist. In the kitchen, barely visible through a small window, figures in white coats work with military precision, their hands moving in rhythm with the controlled chaos of professional cooking. But tonight, this carefully orchestrated world is about to be disrupted by the simple act of a family wanting to share a meal. The Carter family approaches the restaurant as they approach most things in their lives, with a mixture of hope and wariness that comes from years of navigating spaces where their presence is questioned before their humanity is acknowledged. Jamal Carter, 38 years old, walks with the measured confidence of a man who has learned to take up space deliberately. His father was a mechanic who worked 3 jobs to send his son to college. His mother was a teacher who reminded him daily that education was armor against a world that would try to diminish him. Tonight, Jamal wears a charcoal button-down shirt and well-tailored slacks, his shoes polished to mirror brightness. But beneath the careful grooming is a man who has spent his career as a marketing executive learning to navigate boardrooms where he's often the only black face, where his ideas are scrutinized more carefully, where his anger is policed more strictly than his white colleagues. Beside him, Monique Carter moves with the quiet strength of someone who has learned to be both shield and sword for her family. At 35, she's built a successful career as a nurse practitioner, but more importantly, she's built a life centered on the belief that her children deserve to inherit a world better than the one she grew up in. Her burgundy dress is elegant but not ostentatious, her jewelry subtle but quality. She's learned to read rooms the way others read books, to sense the shift in energy when she enters a space, to anticipate the questions that will be asked about her qualifications, her intentions, her right to be there. Their youngest, Malik, is 9 years old and still young enough to believe that the world is mostly good. though old enough to notice when it isn't. He tugs at his navy blazer with the impatience of a child who would rather be anywhere else, but he's been taught to respect the rituals of family dinners, to sit up straight and use his inside voice and say please and thank you even when he doesn't feel like it. His eyes are wide and curious, taking in everything, the way the light catches the crystal glasses, the soft murmur of adult conversation, the careful way his parents hold themselves. Aliyah, at 16, occupies that complex space between childhood and adulthood where everything feels simultaneously urgent and eternal. She's inherited her mother's observant nature and her father's quiet intensity, but she's also part of a generation that has grown up with social media, with the knowledge that any moment can become viral, any injustice can become a hashtag. She scrolls through her phone with the practiced distraction of a teenager, but her eyes are always watching, always cataloging, always ready to bear witness. As they approach the gleaming glass doors of Mitchell's table, the Carter family embodies both the promise and the persistent challenges of American life. They are educated, successful, well-dressed, and well-mannered. They have reservations, both literal and metaphorical. They have money in their wallets and hope in their hearts. They have every right to be here, and they know it. But they also know that rights and reality don't always align, that we reserve the right to refuse service can mean different things to different people, and that sometimes the most insidious forms of discrimination come wrapped in politeness and procedure. The evening air is crisp but not cold, carrying the mixed scents of the city, car exhaust and blooming flowers, food trucks and expensive perfume, the river that winds through downtown, and the coffee shops that never close. Street musicians play on corners, their cases open for donations. Young couples hold hands as they window shop. Families like the Carters move through the urban landscape with purpose, heading to dinner reservations, theater performances, and moments of connection in a world that often feels too busy for connection. As they reach the entrance to Mitchell's table, Jamal places a gentle hand on Malik's shoulder, a gesture that's both protective and encouraging. Monique checks her watch. They're right on time, as they always are. Aliyah pockets her phone, straightening her shoulders in unconscious imitation of her mother. The family pauses for just a moment, taking in the warm light spilling from the windows, the sound of laughter and conversation from within, the promise of a good meal shared in a beautiful space. They don't know that this moment, this threshold between the sidewalk and the restaurant, between expectation and reality, will become a dividing line in their lives. They don't know that their simple desire to have dinner together will become a story that spreads across social media, that their names will be mentioned in news reports, that their dignity will be tested in ways they never imagined. All they know is that they have reservations, they're hungry, and they're together. Sometimes that should be enough. The double glass doors slide open with a soft whisper, and the Carter family steps inside, unaware that they're about to become the center of a story that will ripple far beyond the walls of Mitchell's table, touching lives they'll never meet, changing conversations they'll never hear, and challenging assumptions that have been decades in the making. Emily Harper has been working at Mitchell's table for 8 months, and in that time, she's learned to navigate the complex social geography of high-end dining. At 24, she's young enough to believe that hard work and a bright smile can overcome any obstacle, but old enough to understand that some obstacles are more formidable than others. Her blonde hair is pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her black suit is pressed to perfection, and her smile is her most practiced accessory. Warm when it needs to be, distant when appropriate, apologetic when the situation calls for it. She grew up in a suburb 20 minutes outside the city, in a house with a 2-car garage and a backyard big enough for a swing set. Her parents are good people. Her mother works as a school secretary. Her father manages a hardware store, but they're also people who've lived their entire lives in spaces where they were always the majority, where their comfort was never questioned, where their right to be somewhere was never challenged. They raised Emily to be polite, to follow rules, and to respect authority. They didn't teach her to question whose rules she was following or whose authority she was respecting. When Emily moved to the city for college, she experienced culture shock in ways she hadn't anticipated. The diversity was overwhelming at first, so many different faces, languages, and customs. She learned to navigate it by creating categories, by making assumptions that helped her feel more in control. She learned to code switch, to adjust her behavior based on who was standing in front of her. She learned that some people got the benefit of the doubt and others had to earn it. At Mitchell's table, Emily has become skilled at reading the room, at knowing who belongs and who doesn't, at making quick judgments that protect the restaurant's carefully cultivated atmosphere. She's learned to spot the difference between old money and new money, between people who are comfortable in expensive spaces and people who are trying too hard. She's learned to trust her instincts, even when those instincts are shaped by biases she's never examined. Tonight, when the Carter family approaches her station, Emily's first instinct is caution. She sees their expensive clothes, their confident posture, but she also sees something that makes her pause, a quality she can't quite name but that triggers a familiar response. It's not conscious racism, she would tell herself later. It's just being careful, making sure, following protocol. Kyle Bennett, her colleague, is cut from similar cloth. At 26, he's been working in restaurants since high school, moving up from busboy to server to host through a combination of charm and calculation. He's learned to read people quickly, to categorize them in ways that make his job easier. He's learned that some customers tip better than others, that some are more likely to complain, and that some require more careful handling. He's learned to make these distinctions without thinking of them as prejudice, without recognizing the patterns that inform his judgment. Kyle comes from a working-class family, but he's aspirational in ways that make him protective of spaces he sees as elevated. He believes that success should be earned, that certain standards should be maintained, and that not everyone deserves access to the same experiences. He's never thought of himself as discriminatory. He's just particular about maintaining quality, about preserving the atmosphere that makes Mitchell's table special. Both Emily and Kyle exist in that gray space where individual prejudice meets systemic bias, where personal discomfort masquerades as professional judgment, where the policing of space happens through smile and procedure rather than explicit exclusion. They're not members of the KKK or speakers at white nationalist rallies. They're just young people who've learned to navigate the world in ways that feel natural to them, never questioning why those ways consistently disadvantage the same groups of people. The restaurant's management structure reinforces these dynamics. Brian Foster, the front-of-house manager, is 32 and has worked his way up through a series of increasingly upscale establishments. He's learned that success in hospitality means creating an environment where the right people feel comfortable, where potential problems are addressed before they become actual problems, where the appearance of discrimination is avoided even if discrimination itself isn't. Brian is skilled at corporate speak, at finding language that sounds inclusive while maintaining exclusivity. He talks about maintaining standards and preserving the dining experience and ensuring customer satisfaction. He's learned to make decisions that protect the restaurant's reputation while never explicitly acknowledging the biases that inform those decisions. Behind these frontline staff members is a culture that prizes conformity over inclusion, that values the comfort of existing customers over the dignity of potential new ones. It's a culture that has developed organically over time, shaped by hundreds of small decisions and unstated assumptions. It's a culture where fit matters more than fairness, where the benefit of the doubt is distributed unequally, where the phrase, "we reserve the right to refuse service," carries different weight depending on who's being served. The staff at Mitchell's table aren't monsters. They're ordinary people working in a system that has taught them to make distinctions they don't fully understand. to enforce standards they haven't examined, to protect an atmosphere they've never questioned. They're products of their environment, shaped by experiences that have taught them to see some people as belonging and others as potentially disruptive. But the impact of their actions doesn't depend on their intentions. The hurt they cause doesn't diminish because they don't mean to cause it. The exclusion they practice doesn't become less harmful because they've learned to dress it up in politeness and procedure. Tonight, as the Carter family approaches the host's stand, these dynamics are about to collide with people who refuse to be diminished, who understand their worth, who won't accept exclusion wrapped in apology. The evening is about to become a test of character, a moment when the comfortable assumptions of the restaurant's culture meet the uncomfortable reality of their impact. Emily straightens her shoulders and adjusts her smile, preparing to do what she's been trained to do. Kyle positions himself nearby, ready to support whatever decision needs to be made. Brian hovers in the background, observing, calculating, preparing to intervene if necessary. None of them realize that they're about to become the antagonists in a story that will force them to confront the gap between their self-perception and their actions, between their intentions and their impact, between the comfort of their assumptions and the discomfort of the truth. The Carter family steps forward, and the evening begins its slow transformation from routine to reckoning. The air inside Mitchell's table carries the weight of expectation. Conversations hum at the perfect volume, audible enough to create atmosphere, quiet enough to maintain intimacy. The lighting casts everyone in their most flattering glow, and the soft jazz creates a soundtrack for the kind of evening that people will remember fondly. It's a Tuesday night masquerading as a special occasion, the kind of place where ordinary moments are elevated by setting and circumstance. Emily sees the Carter family approaching and feels that familiar tightness in her chest, the response she's learned to trust when something feels off, when the carefully maintained equilibrium of the dining room might be disrupted. She's learned to read subtle cues, the way people carry themselves, the way they look around the space, the way they approach her station. The Carters look confident, which somehow makes her more wary rather than less. "Good evening," Emily says, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of professional hospitality. "Do you have a reservation?" The question hangs in the air longer than it should. It's a simple question, asked dozens of times each night, but somehow it feels different this time. The emphasis is subtle. "Do you have a reservation?" As if the answer isn't already assumed, as if the question itself is a gentle challenge. Jamal steps forward, his voice steady and clear. "Yes, for Carter, 7 o'clock. He's learned to speak clearly in situations like this, to articulate each word with precision, to avoid any ambiguity that might be used against him. He's learned that mumbling or casual speech can be interpreted as unprofessional, while speaking too formally can be seen as pretentious. He's learned to find the exact right tone, confident but not aggressive, clear but not demanding, friendly but not overly familiar. Emily's fingers hover over her iPad, but her eyes barely scan the screen. She's already made her decision, already chosen her path forward. The reservation system is just a prop in the performance she's about to give. "Carter, you said?" she repeats, her voice carrying just enough uncertainty to plant seeds of doubt. Behind the Carters, other guests are arriving. A middle-aged white couple approaches the parallel station where Kyle is working. Their greeting is entirely different. Immediate recognition, warm smiles, a sense of belonging that requires no verification. Kyle finds their reservation instantly, their coats are whisked away, and they're escorted to their table with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed dance. The contrast isn't lost on Aliyah, who glances between the two interactions with the sharp awareness of a teenager who's learned to notice these discrepancies. She catches her mother's eye and raises an eyebrow, a silent communication that passes between them, a shared recognition of patterns they've seen before. Emily continues to tap her screen, creating the impression of thorough searching while barely looking at the information displayed. She's learned to use technology as a shield, to hide behind the supposed objectivity of computer systems while exercising entirely subjective judgment. "I'm sorry," she says, her voice carrying the perfect note of apologetic professionalism. "I don't see a reservation for Carter." The words land like a physical blow. Not because they're unexpected. The Carter family has experienced this before, in different forms and different spaces, but because they're so familiar, so tired, so predictable. The polite apology that isn't really an apology. The system error that somehow only affects certain people. The perfectly reasonable explanation that doesn't feel reasonable at all. Monique steps forward, her voice gentle but firm. "We booked online and I received a confirmation call this afternoon. She's learned to document everything, to save emails and screenshot confirmations, to create a paper trail that can't be easily dismissed. She's learned that her word alone isn't always enough, that she needs evidence to support claims that should be self-evident." Emily's response is a shrug that manages to be both dismissive and sympathetic. "Unfortunately, we're completely full tonight. I can put you on the wait list, but it's a long one." The offer of a wait list is calculated. It provides the appearance of accommodation while offering no real solution. It's a way of saying yes that really means no, a way of appearing helpful while being fundamentally unhelpful. The restaurant continues to buzz around them, other diners oblivious to the drama playing out at the host stand. A businessman checks his phone while waiting for his table. A young couple shares a laugh over cocktails at the bar. The mundane business of dining continues, but for the Carter family, time has slowed to a crawl. Jamal keeps his voice level, drawing on years of experience in corporate environments where losing his temper would be career suicide. "We have a confirmation. You called at 3 o'clock. Monique Carter, 7 o'clock reservation." The specificity of his response is intentional. He's learned that vague complaints can be easily dismissed, but specific details are harder to ignore. He's learned to be precise, to be concrete, to make his case with facts rather than feelings. Emily's lips press together in a thin line. She's been trained to de-escalate situations, to find solutions that preserve the restaurant's reputation while maintaining its policies. But she's also been trained to recognize when accommodation might set dangerous precedents, when flexibility might be interpreted as weakness. "I can't seat you if your name's not in the system, sir," she says, the word "sir" carrying just enough emphasis to be respectful and condescending simultaneously. Behind the Carters, whispers are beginning to circulate. Other guests are noticing the extended conversation, the visible tension, and the way the staff is handling the situation. Some are genuinely curious, others are uncomfortable with the potential for conflict in their carefully curated dining experience. A few are already forming opinions, taking sides in a confrontation they don't fully understand. Aaliyah, who has been quiet throughout the exchange, finally speaks up. Her voice is steady but carries the particular tremor that only teenagers can master. The sound of someone who's old enough to understand injustice, but young enough to believe it can be easily corrected. "Can you check again? Maybe it's under my dad's name." The request is reasonable, the kind of simple accommodation that restaurants make hundreds of times each night. Mixed up names, alternative spellings, reservations made under different family members. These are common issues with simple solutions. But Emily barely looks at the screen before responding. "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. Like I said, you're welcome to wait, but it'll be at least an hour, probably more." The offer to wait is meaningless. They all know it. An hour wait on a Friday night at a fully booked restaurant is essentially a polite dismissal. It's a way of saying go away while maintaining the fiction of customer service. At this point, Brian Foster, the manager, appears as if summoned by the growing tension. He's mastered the art of intervention, arriving at just the right moment to demonstrate management concern while supporting staff decisions. His smile is practiced, his voice carries authority, and his presence is meant to signal that the situation is under control. "Is there a problem here, Emily?" he asks, though he already knows the answer. Emily straightens, relief evident in her voice. They don't have a reservation and we're full. The summary is efficient and misleading. It reduces the complexity of the situation to a simple binary. They have a reservation or they don't. They can be seated or they can't. It eliminates the gray areas, the judgment calls, the human element that defines hospitality. Brian glances at the Carter family, his expression suggesting that he's seeing them for the first time, though he's been watching the interaction from across the room. His assessment is quick and decisive. These people are a problem that needs to be managed, not guests who need to be served. "I'm sorry, folks," he says, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "We really are slammed tonight, but if you'd like to leave your name and number, maybe we can call you if something opens up." The offer is hollow. Everyone knows that last-minute cancellations at restaurants like Mitchell's Table are immediately filled by regular customers, VIP guests, or people with connections. The wait list is a fiction, a way of making rejection seem like accommodation. Jamal's composure finally begins to crack. He spent his entire adult life learning to navigate situations like this, learning to bite his tongue, learning to find diplomatic solutions to problems that shouldn't exist. But watching his children witness this humiliation, seeing the confused hurt in Malik's eyes and the angry recognition in Alia's, pushes him past his carefully maintained boundaries. "We did everything right," he says, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge of frustration. "Why does it feel like we're being turned away for a different reason?" The question hangs in the air like an accusation. It names the thing that everyone has been dancing around, the subtext that has been driving the entire interaction. It forces the staff to confront the possibility that their actions might be motivated by something other than policy and procedure. Brian's smile falters for just a moment, a micro-expression that reveals the discomfort beneath his professional veneer. He's been trained to handle complaints about service, food quality, wait times, and prices. He hasn't been trained to handle direct challenges to his integrity, questions about his motivations, or accusations of discrimination. "That's not what's happening, sir," he says, his voice carrying a note of wounded dignity. "We just have to go by the system." The appeal to the system is reflexive, a way of removing personal responsibility from the equation, of suggesting that policies and procedures are neutral arbiters of fairness. It's a way of saying it's not personal while engaging in behavior that feels deeply personal to those on the receiving end. But the Carter family knows better. They've learned to recognize the patterns, to see the consistency in inconsistency, to understand that the system is often just a way of institutionalizing bias. They've learned that discrimination rarely announces itself with burning crosses and white hoods. More often, it hides behind clipboards and computer screens, behind policies and procedures that appear neutral but function to exclude. As the conversation continues, drawing more attention from other diners, the restaurant's carefully maintained atmosphere begins to shift. The comfortable bubble of privilege that surrounds spaces like Mitchell's Table starts to deflate, revealing the tensions and inequities that money and manners usually keep hidden. The Carter family stands at the host stand, dignified in their frustration, professional in their protest, but ultimately powerless against the combined forces of institutional bias and individual prejudice. They've done everything right. Made reservations, arrived on time, dressed appropriately, behaved respectfully, but none of it matters when the game is rigged, when the rules can be changed at will, when their presence is seen as a problem rather than a pleasure. The evening that began with hope and anticipation is transforming into something else entirely, a moment of reckoning that will force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about fairness, dignity, and the price of belonging in a world that prizes exclusion over inclusion. The silence that follows the Carter family's departure is thick with unspoken tension. The restaurant's carefully orchestrated atmosphere has been disrupted, not by raised voices or dramatic gestures, but by the quiet dignity of people who refuse to be diminished. The other diners try to return to their conversations, but there's a self-conscious quality to their interactions now, an awareness that they've witnessed something that challenges the comfortable assumptions of their evening out. Emily returns to her station, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffles through reservation confirmations. The adrenaline of confrontation is wearing off, replaced by a complex mixture of justified defensiveness and nagging doubt. She tells herself she did the right thing, followed proper procedures, and maintained professional standards. But something about the interaction sits uneasily in her chest, a weight that she can't quite shake. Kyle leans against the host's stand, checking his watch and scrolling through his phone with studied casualness. He's already crafting the story he'll tell later about the difficult customers who tried to cause a scene, about the importance of maintaining standards, about the challenges of working in high-end hospitality. The narrative he's constructing serves multiple purposes. It justifies his actions, protects his self-image, and reinforces his belief that he's done nothing wrong. "Glad that didn't turn into a scene," he whispers to Emily, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believes he's successfully navigated a potential crisis. Emily forces a laugh, but it sounds hollow even to her own ears. She wants to feel the camaraderie that Kyle is offering, the shared sense of professional accomplishment, but something prevents her from fully embracing it. Maybe it's the memory of the youngest boy's confused face, or the teenager's pointed observation about equal treatment, or the mother's gentle but firm insistence that they had confirmed reservations. Behind the bar, Lisa Walker has been watching the entire interaction with growing unease. At 42, she's worked in restaurants for over 2 decades, and she's seen this movie before. She's witnessed the subtle ways that discrimination operates in supposedly inclusive spaces, the coded language that staff use to exclude unwanted guests, and the policies that appear neutral but function to maintain segregation. Lisa comes from a different background than Emily and Kyle. She grew up in a working-class family in a neighborhood where diversity wasn't an abstract concept, but a daily reality. She learned early that fairness isn't automatic, that justice requires active effort, that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. She's not perfect. She has her own biases, her own blind spots. But she's developed a sensitivity to inequality that comes from personal experience. "You know," she says quietly to Emily as she passes the host's stand, "it wouldn't kill you to show a little more respect." Emily stiffens, her defensive walls rising immediately. "I just do what Brian says. He makes the rules." The response is telling. It shifts responsibility upward, positioning Emily as a passive implementer of policies rather than an active participant in discrimination. It's a common psychological defense mechanism, a way of maintaining self-esteem while engaging in behavior that conflicts with stated values. Lisa shakes her head, lighting a cigarette as she steps outside for her break. "Rules change," she mutters, "when the right person walks through that door." Her comment hangs in the air, a challenge to the comfortable narrative that the staff has constructed. It suggests that the rules they claim to follow are actually malleable, that the system they appeal to is actually subjective, and that the standards they maintain are actually selective. Inside the restaurant, Brian Foster moves through the dining room with renewed energy, checking on tables, chatting with regular customers, and performing the role of attentive manager. He's convinced himself that he's successfully handled a potential problem, that he's protected the restaurant's reputation and maintained its standards. He doesn't notice the way some diners glance at him with new awareness, the way conversations pause when he approaches, the way the atmosphere has subtly shifted. In the kitchen, the staff continues their work largely oblivious to the drama that has unfolded in the front of the house. Anthony Miller, the sous chef, barks orders at his line cooks, focused on ticket times and food quality. The kitchen operates on different principles than the dining room. Meritocracy matters more than demographics, skill counts more than appearance, and the pressure of service leaves little room for the subtle prejudices that flourish in customer-facing roles. But not everyone is unaware. Zachary Holmes, one of the senior servers, caught the tail end of the interaction as he was delivering drinks to a nearby table. He's 28, black, and intimately familiar with the dynamics he just witnessed. He's experienced them from both sides, as a customer who's been made to feel unwelcome, and as a staff member who's been pressured to make others feel the same way. Zachary occupies a complicated position at Mitchell's table. He's respected by his colleagues for his professionalism and work ethic, but he's also aware that his presence serves a dual purpose. He's both a valued employee and a form of insurance against accusations of discrimination. He's learned to navigate these waters carefully, to build relationships with coworkers while maintaining his integrity, to succeed within systems that weren't designed for his success. Tonight, watching the Carter family leave with their dignity intact but their evening ruined, Zachary feels the familiar weight of moral complexity. He knows that speaking up could jeopardize his position, that challenging the status quo could make him a target, that standing up for what's right could cost him his livelihood. But he also knows that silence makes him complicit, that inaction makes him part of the problem, that his comfort depends on others' discomfort. As the evening progresses, the restaurant settles back into its routine. Orders are taken, meals are served, and checks are processed. The machinery of hospitality continues to function, but something has changed. The incident with the Carter family has introduced a crack in the facade, a reminder that beneath the polished surface of Mitchell's table lie the same tensions and inequities that plague society at large. Emily finds herself double-checking reservation lists, looking more carefully at names and confirmations. She tells herself she's being thorough, maintaining professional standards, but part of her is also looking for evidence that might justify her earlier actions. She's caught between the desire to prove she was right and the growing suspicion that she was wrong. Kyle continues his shift with forced normalcy, but he's more aware of the demographics of incoming guests, more conscious of the assumptions he makes about who belongs and who doesn't. He's not ready to admit that he was wrong, but he's beginning to question whether he was entirely right. Brian maintains his management persona, but he's also calculating potential consequences. He's wondering if the incident will be reported, if it will reach the owner, and if it will require damage control. He's thinking about how to frame the story if questions are asked, how to protect his position if accusations are made. Lisa continues her work behind the bar, but she's also watching her colleagues more closely, paying attention to patterns she's previously ignored. She's thinking about her own role in the restaurant's culture, her own responsibility for the atmosphere that made tonight's incident possible. Zachary serves his tables with his usual professionalism, but he's also composing messages in his head, thinking about conversations he needs to have, decisions he needs to make. He's reached a point where silence feels like betrayal, where neutrality feels like complicity, where maintaining his position requires sacrificing his principles. The restaurant continues to operate, but the easy assumptions that once guided its culture have been shaken. The Carter family's brief presence has introduced questions that demand answers, challenges that require responses, and moral complexities that can't be easily resolved. As the evening winds down and the last customers finish their meals, the staff begins the familiar routine of closing duties. Tables are cleared, floors are cleaned, and registers are counted. The physical traces of the evening are erased, but the emotional and psychological impact lingers. Emily goes home to her apartment, but she can't shake the memory of the interaction. She finds herself scrolling through social media, looking for validation of her actions, seeking evidence that she did the right thing. She's not finding what she's looking for. Kyle returns to his apartment and opens a beer, trying to unwind from the shift. He tells himself that he successfully navigated a difficult situation, that he protected the restaurant's standards, that he did his job well. But his confidence feels forced, his satisfaction hollow. Brian drives home through the city streets, already planning his report to the owner. He's rehearsing the story he'll tell, the spin he'll put on the incident, the way he'll frame his actions as necessary and appropriate. He's not thinking about the Carter family's experience, their feelings, or their dignity. He's thinking about his own position, his own reputation, his own future. Lisa takes the bus home, staring out the window at the city passing by. She's thinking about her own childhood, her own experiences with discrimination, her own responsibilities as someone who's witnessed injustice. She's wondering if she could have done more, should have said more, ought to have intervened more directly. Zachary walks to his car, checking his phone for messages. He's thinking about the conversation he needs to have with his partner, the decision he needs to make about his future at Mitchell's table, the courage he needs to find to speak truth to power. The restaurant is empty now, its lights dimmed, its doors locked, but the impact of the evening's events continues to ripple outward, touching lives, challenging assumptions, forcing reckonings that will reshape the culture of Mitchell's table and the people who work there. The city sleeps, but Harold Mitchell lies awake in his downtown penthouse, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the phone call that changed everything. It came at 11:47 p.m., just as he was preparing for bed after a long day of meetings with investors and suppliers. The voice on the other end was familiar. Marcus Washington, a local civil rights attorney and longtime friend who'd been tracking social media chatter about businesses in the district. "Harold," Marcus had said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment, "we need to talk about what happened at your restaurant tonight." The conversation that followed was brief but devastating. Marcus described the social media posts that were beginning to circulate, the eyewitness accounts, and the growing anger in the community. He spoke about the Carter family with the respect they deserved, describing their reputation, their character, and their standing in the community. He spoke about the restaurant's staff with the disappointment of someone who'd expected better. Harold Mitchell had built his restaurant empire on the belief that food could bring people together, that hospitality could bridge divides, that a well-run establishment could become a cornerstone of community life. He'd grown up in this very neighborhood, back when it was still rough around the edges, when his grandmother ran a small diner that served anyone who came through the door with respect and dignity. Her philosophy had been simple: feed people good food, treat them right, and they'll come back. Now, at 58, Harold owned 3 restaurants and was preparing to open a 4th. He'd built his reputation on quality, consistency, and what he believed was inclusive hospitality. He'd hired diverse staff, supported local charities, and prided himself on creating spaces where everyone could feel welcome. But Marcus's call had shattered that comfortable self-image, forcing him to confront the gap between his intentions and his impact. "Harold, you know I've always supported your businesses," Marcus had continued, his voice gentle but firm. "But this isn't just about one family being turned away. This is about a pattern, about a culture that's developed in your restaurant. People are talking, and they're not saying good things." The phrase pattern hit Harold like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers before, comments from friends in the Black community about feeling unwelcome at Mitchell's table, suggestions that the restaurant catered to a certain clientele, observations about who got the best tables and who got shuttled to the back. He'd dismissed these as isolated incidents, misunderstandings, the inevitable friction that comes with running a high-end establishment. But Marcus's call suggested something more systematic, more troubling. "What exactly are they saying?" Harold had asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Marcus had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "They're saying that Mitchell's table has become a place where Black folks aren't welcome. They're saying that your staff has learned to find excuses, to create barriers, to make people feel like they don't belong. They're saying that your restaurant has become a symbol of everything wrong with this neighborhood's gentrification." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Harold had worked his entire career to build something positive, to create spaces that brought people together. The idea that his restaurant had become a symbol of exclusion, of gentrification's harmful effects, Felt like a betrayal of everything he'd tried to accomplish. After the call ended, Harold had spent the rest of the night pacing his apartment, replaying conversations, reconsidering incidents, questioning assumptions he'd never examined. He thought about his staff, about the hiring decisions he'd made, about the culture he'd allowed to develop. He thought about the neighborhood around his restaurant, about the changes that had occurred over the past decade, about his own role in those changes. By morning, Harold had made a decision. He would not let his restaurant become a symbol of exclusion. He would not allow his staff to perpetuate discrimination. He would not stand by while his establishment contributed to the very problems he'd spent his career trying to solve. The next day, Harold arrived at Mitchell's table early, before any of his staff. He sat in the empty dining room looking at the space with new eyes. The elegant decor, the carefully curated atmosphere, the subtle markers of exclusivity. All of it suddenly felt different. He began to see how the restaurant's very design might signal who was welcome and who wasn't, how the emphasis on sophistication might actually be code for something else entirely. When Brian Foster arrived for his shift, Harold was waiting for him. "We need to talk," Harold said, his voice carrying an authority that Brian had rarely heard. They sat at a corner table, the same table where the Carter family should have been seated the night before. Harold had done his homework since Marcus's call, reaching out to contacts in the community, gathering information about the incident, learning about the family that had been turned away. "Tell me about last night," Harold said, his voice deceptively calm. Brian launched into his prepared narrative, the busy evening, the reservation system glitch, the professional way his staff had handled a difficult situation. He spoke about maintaining standards, protecting the restaurant's reputation, following established procedures. His story was smooth, practiced, designed to position him as a competent manager who'd successfully navigated a challenging situation. But Harold had heard a different version of events. He'd learned about the Carter family's confirmed reservation, about the way they'd been treated, about the contrast between their experience and that of other guests. He'd learned about the whispers among his staff, the assumptions that guided their decisions, the culture that had developed under his nose. "Brian," Harold said when the manager finished his story, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. The Carter family had a confirmed reservation. They were treated with disrespect and discrimination. And from what I'm hearing, this isn't the first time something like this has happened." Brian's composure faltered slightly. He'd been expecting validation, perhaps even praise for his handling of the situation. Instead, he was being challenged, questioned, held accountable for decisions he'd thought were appropriate. "Harold, I was just following our policies." "Our policies," Harold interrupted, "are not supposed to exclude people based on race. Our policies are supposed to ensure that everyone who comes through that door is treated with dignity and respect. If your interpretation of our policies is leading to discrimination, then we need to change how we're doing things." The conversation that followed was difficult and necessary. Harold forced Brian to confront the assumptions that had guided his decision-making, to examine the biases that had shaped his judgment, to acknowledge the impact of his actions on the Carter family and the broader community. Brian resisted at first, defending his actions as reasonable and appropriate. He spoke about the challenges of managing a high-end restaurant, about the importance of maintaining standards, about the difficulty of reading situations in real time. But Harold pressed him, asking specific questions about the Carter family's treatment, about the procedures that had been followed, about the decisions that had been made. Gradually, Brian's defensive narrative began to crack. He was forced to acknowledge that he'd made assumptions about the Carter family, that he'd treated them differently than he would have treated white customers, and that he'd allowed his biases to influence his professional judgment. The realization was uncomfortable, challenging his self-image as a fair and competent manager. "This stops now," Harold said finally. "We're going to implement new policies, new training, new accountability measures. We're going to make sure that every guest who walks through that door is treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of their race, their background, or their appearance." The changes Harold implemented were comprehensive and immediate. He brought in diversity and inclusion consultants to conduct training sessions with all staff members. He revised the restaurant's policies to eliminate ambiguity and reduce opportunities for discriminatory decision-making. He established new accountability measures, including regular audits of seating patterns and customer interactions. But more importantly, Harold began to change the culture of Mitchell's Table. He started eating at the restaurant regularly, observing interactions, and engaging with staff and customers. He made it clear that discrimination of any kind would not be tolerated, that inclusive hospitality was not optional, and that the restaurant's success depended on welcoming all guests. The changes were not without resistance. Some staff members, including Emily and Kyle, struggled to adapt to the new expectations. They'd grown comfortable with the old ways of doing things, with the ability to make subjective judgments about who belonged and who didn't. The new policies felt restrictive, challenging, and uncomfortable. Emily, in particular, found herself questioning her fit within the new Mitchell's Table. She'd built her professional identity around her ability to read situations, to make quick judgments, and to maintain the restaurant's standards. The new emphasis on inclusion felt like a criticism of her previous work, a suggestion that she'd been doing her job wrong. "I don't understand why everything has to change," she complained to Kyle during a break. "We were doing fine before. Our customers were happy. The restaurant was successful." Kyle nodded in agreement, but his confidence was shaken. He'd begun to notice things he'd previously ignored, the way white customers were greeted versus black customers, the assumptions he made about people based on their appearance, the subtle ways that discrimination operated in his daily work. "Maybe we weren't doing as fine as we thought," he said quietly, surprising himself with his honesty. Lisa, meanwhile, found herself energized by the changes. She'd spent years watching discrimination operate in the restaurant industry, feeling complicit in systems she couldn't change. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was working for an organization that was serious about inclusion, that was willing to confront its own biases and make meaningful changes. "It's about time," she said to Zachary as they prepared for the evening shift. "I was starting to think I'd have to find another job." Zachary nodded, but his feelings were complicated. He appreciated the changes, welcomed the new policies, and respected Harold's commitment to inclusion. But he also knew that changing policies was easier than changing hearts, that training sessions couldn't eliminate biases that had been years in the making, that the real test would come when the new systems were tested by real-world situations. The first major test came 3 weeks later, when the Carter family returned to Mitchell's Table. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that makes even urban landscapes look beautiful. Jamal Carter sat in his car outside Mitchell's Table, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he watched other diners enter the restaurant. 3 weeks had passed since their humiliating encounter. 3 weeks during which their story had spread through social media, local news, and community networks. The response had been overwhelming. Friends and strangers had reached out with similar stories, sharing their own experiences of discrimination at restaurants, hotels, and retail establishments. The incident had become a catalyst for broader conversations about inclusion, about the subtle ways that racism operates in supposedly progressive spaces, about the ongoing struggle for dignity and respect. But it had also been exhausting. Jamal and Monique had found themselves reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, asked to speak at community meetings, interviewed by local reporters, invited to serve on diversity committees. They'd never wanted to be activists, they just wanted to have dinner with their children. "Are you sure about this?" Monique asked, her voice carrying the weight of their shared uncertainty. They'd received a personal invitation from Harold Mitchell himself, a handwritten note that had arrived at their home a week earlier. The letter was thoughtful, humble, and deeply apologetic. Harold had acknowledged what had happened, taken responsibility for his restaurant's culture, and outlined the changes he was implementing. He'd invited them to return as his guests, not as a publicity stunt, but as a genuine attempt to make amends. The invitation had sparked long conversations in the Carter household. Aaliyah had been skeptical, suspicious of what she saw as a corporate PR move designed to manage the negative publicity. Malik had been more forgiving, his 9-year-old optimism intact despite the earlier disappointment. Jamal and Monique had been divided, torn between their desire to move forward and their uncertainty about whether real change was possible. "I think we have to try," Jamal said finally. "If we don't give them a chance to do better, how can we expect things to change?" Monique nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. She'd spent her career in healthcare, a field where second chances could literally be matters of life and death. She believed in people's capacity for growth, for learning, for change. But she also knew that good intentions didn't always translate into meaningful action, that apologies were easy, but transformation was hard. They'd decided to return, but on their own terms. They'd made a reservation under Monique's name, arrived at their designated time, and approached the restaurant with cautious hope. They'd dressed well, but not ostentatiously, prepared themselves for the possibility of disappointment, and committed to giving the evening a genuine chance. As they approached the entrance, Jamal noticed the small changes that had been made. The host's stand had been repositioned to create a more welcoming entry experience. The reservation system had been updated with digital tablets that displayed information more clearly. Most importantly, the staff at the front of the house looked different, more diverse, more representative of the community the restaurant served. The woman who greeted them was new, someone they didn't recognize from their previous visit. She was black, probably in her early 30s, with natural hair and a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than performative. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying easy confidence. "Welcome to Mitchell's table. Do you have a reservation?" The question was the same as before, but the tone was entirely different. There was no suspicion, no doubt, no suggestion that their presence was unexpected or unwelcome. It was simply a professional greeting, the kind of interaction that should have been routine but had become remarkable by its absence. "Yes," Monique replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Carter, for 7 o'clock. The hostess, her name tag read Destiny, immediately found their reservation on the tablet, her finger moving quickly across the screen. "Perfect. I have you right here. Your table is ready. Would you like to check your coats?" The efficiency was striking. No delays, no second-guessing, no extended searches through the reservation system. Within moments, they were being escorted to their table, walking through the dining room they'd been denied access to just 3 weeks earlier. The restaurant looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. The staff moved with the same professional grace, but there was something more welcoming about their demeanor. The lighting was warm, the jazz was soft, the conversations were intimate. It was everything they'd hoped for during their first visit. Their table was in the main dining room, not tucked away in a corner or hidden near the kitchen. It was well positioned, with a view of the restaurant and easy access to the bar. The message was clear. They were welcome here, they belonged here, they were valued guests. As they settled into their seats, Jamal noticed the other diners. The restaurant was busy, filled with the same mix of professionals, couples, and families that had been there before. But he also noticed more diversity than he remembered, more black faces, more families that looked like his own. Either his memory was faulty, or the restaurant had genuinely expanded its customer base. Their server approached within minutes, a young man with careful manners and obvious training. He introduced himself as Marcus. The irony of the name wasn't lost on Jamal. Recited the evening's specials and offered to answer any questions about the menu. His service was attentive but not overly familiar, professional but not stiff. "Can I start you off with anything to drink?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd been well-trained. As they ordered cocktails and reviewed the menu, the Carter family began to relax. The food was excellent, the service was seamless, and the atmosphere was welcoming. It was, in every way, the experience they'd hoped for during their first visit. But the evening was about more than good food and professional service. It was about dignity, about respect, about the possibility of change. It was about the hope that institutions could evolve, that people could grow, that the persistent problems of discrimination could be addressed through commitment and action. Halfway through dinner, Harold Mitchell himself appeared at their table. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that carried the weight of genuine remorse. He approached them with obvious nervousness, his usual confidence replaced by humility. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice carrying the formality of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "I'm Harold Mitchell. I want to thank you for giving us another chance." The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary. Harold apologized again for their earlier treatment, acknowledged the changes he'd implemented, and committed to ongoing improvement. He didn't make excuses, didn't minimize their experience, didn't try to shift responsibility. He simply owned the failure and promised to do better. "I built this restaurant to bring people together," he said quietly. "Learning that it had become a place where people felt unwelcome was the most painful lesson of my career. I'm grateful that you're giving us the opportunity to prove that we can do better." Monique found herself moved by his sincerity. She'd expected corporate speak, carefully crafted apologies designed to manage public relations. Instead, she encountered a man who seemed genuinely shaken by what had happened, genuinely committed to change. "We appreciate the efforts you've made," she said carefully. "But change isn't just about policies and procedures. It's about culture, about the daily choices that people make when they think no one is watching." Harold nodded, acknowledging the truth of her observation. "You're right. That's why we're not just changing rules, we're changing how we think about hospitality, about inclusion, about what it means to welcome people into our space." The conversation continued for several more minutes, touching on the changes that had been implemented, the ongoing challenges, the commitment to continuous improvement. It was a conversation that should have happened weeks earlier, but it was happening now, and that felt like progress. As Harold returned to his other duties, the Carter family finished their meal in contemplative silence. The food had been excellent, the service had been professional, and the atmosphere had been welcoming. In every measurable way, the evening had been a success. But the real test wasn't this single evening, carefully managed and closely monitored. The real test would be whether the changes would persist, whether the new culture would take root, whether the commitment to inclusion would survive the pressures of daily business. As they prepared to leave, Destiny approached their table with a warm smile. "I hope you enjoyed your evening," she said. "We'd love to have you back any time." The invitation felt genuine, not performative. It was the kind of interaction that should be routine but had become remarkable by its previous absence. As they walked to their car, the Carter family reflected on the evening's significance. "It was better," Aaliyah said, her teenage skepticism tempered by acknowledgement. "But one good night doesn't erase what happened before." Malik, ever the optimist, was more enthusiastic. "The food was really good and everyone was nice. Maybe they really did change." Jamal and Monique exchanged glances, sharing the complex emotions that the evening had stirred. They were pleased by the changes they'd witnessed, encouraged by Harold's commitment, hopeful about the possibility of genuine transformation. But they were also aware that real change takes time, that good intentions don't always translate into lasting results, that the test of institutional change isn't a single evening but sustained commitment over time. "We'll see," Monique said quietly. "Change is possible, but it's not automatic. It requires constant vigilance, constant commitment, constant willingness to do the hard work of examining our biases and confronting our failures." As they drove home through the city streets, the Carter family carried with them the complex legacy of their experience. They'd been hurt, but they'd also been heard. They'd been excluded, but they'd also been welcomed back. They'd been disappointed, but they'd also been hopeful. Their story had become larger than themselves, touching conversations about inclusion, dignity, and the ongoing work of building a more just society. But at its heart, It remained a simple story about a family who wanted to share a meal, who deserved to be treated with respect, who had the courage to demand the dignity that should have been freely given. The evening represented progress, but it also represented the ongoing nature of the work. Change was possible, but it wasn't inevitable. It required commitment, vigilance, and the willingness to continue the conversation even when it was uncomfortable. As they pulled into their driveway, the Carter family knew that their story was far from over. The evening at Mitchell's table had been a victory, but it was a victory that would need to be defended, sustained, and expanded. The work of building a more inclusive society continued, one conversation at a time, one interaction at a time, one family at a time. 6 months after the Carter family's return visit, Mitchell's table had become a different kind of restaurant. The changes went far beyond new policies and diversity training. They had fundamentally altered the culture of the establishment, creating ripple effects that extended throughout the organization and into the broader community. Emily Harper had been among the first casualties of the transformation. Despite multiple training sessions and coaching conversations, she'd struggled to adapt to the new expectations. Her discomfort with the changes had been palpable, affecting her interactions with guests and creating tension with her colleagues. After several incidents and warnings, she'd ultimately decided to leave, finding a position at a more traditional establishment where her old habits would be less challenged. Her departure had been difficult but necessary. Harold had given her every opportunity to grow, to learn, to change. He'd provided additional training, paired her with mentors, and offered coaching on unconscious bias. But Emily had been unable or unwilling to examine her own assumptions, to confront the ways that her behavior had contributed to a culture of exclusion. "Some people can change," Harold had reflected to Marcus during one of their monthly check-ins. "Others are too invested in the old ways of doing things." Kyle had proven more adaptable, though his transformation had been gradual and sometimes painful. The diversity training had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own biases, his assumptions about who belonged in upscale spaces, and his role in perpetuating discrimination. The process had been humbling, challenging his self-image as a fair and professional person. But Kyle had also discovered something surprising in the process. The new approach to hospitality was actually more rewarding than the old one. When he stopped making assumptions about guests based on their appearance, when he approached every interaction with genuine warmth and respect, his job became more fulfilling. He found himself building better relationships with customers, receiving better tips, and taking more pride in his work. "I didn't realize how much energy I was wasting on judging people," he confided to Lisa during a quiet moment. "Now I just focus on making everyone feel welcome, and it's actually easier." Lisa had emerged as an unexpected leader in the restaurant's transformation. Her years of experience, her sensitivity to discrimination, and her commitment to inclusion had made her a valuable voice in shaping the new culture. Harold had promoted her to assistant manager, recognizing her ability to model the kind of hospitality he wanted to see throughout the restaurant. "It's not just about being nice to people," Lisa explained to new hires during orientation. "It's about recognizing that everyone who walks through that door has the right to be treated with dignity and respect. Our job is to create an environment where people feel valued, not judged." Zachary had also benefited from the changes, finding his voice as an advocate for inclusion within the restaurant. His perspective as a Black employee had been invaluable in helping his colleagues understand the impact of discrimination, the importance of representation, and the need for ongoing vigilance. Harold had asked him to help develop training materials and to serve as a resource for other staff members. "The thing about discrimination," Zachary had explained during one training session, "is that it's often invisible to the people who aren't experiencing it. You might not notice that Black customers are being seated in less desirable sections, or that their service is slower, or that they're being treated with less warmth. But we notice. We always notice. The new staff members Harold had hired brought fresh perspectives and diverse experiences to the restaurant. Destiny, the hostess who had greeted the Carter family on their return visit, had quickly become a favorite among both colleagues and customers. Her natural warmth and professional competence had set a new standard for front-of-house service. "I love working here," she told her mother during a family dinner. "It's the first restaurant job I've had where I don't have to worry about being treated differently because of my race." Harold is serious about creating an inclusive environment, and it shows. The changes had also attracted new customers to Mitchell's table. Word had spread through the community about the restaurant's transformation, drawing diners who had previously felt unwelcome or uncomfortable. The customer base had become more diverse, more representative of the neighborhood's demographics, more reflective of the city's changing population. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Harold himself. The incident with the Carter family had forced him to confront his own blind spots, his own assumptions about hospitality and inclusion. He'd realized that good intentions weren't enough, that creating an inclusive environment required active effort, ongoing commitment, and willingness to be uncomfortable. "I thought I was running an inclusive restaurant," he admitted to Marcus during one of their conversations. "But I was really just running a restaurant that didn't explicitly exclude people. There's a big difference." Harold had thrown himself into the work of transformation with the same intensity he'd brought to building his business. He'd read books on unconscious bias, attended conferences on diversity and inclusion, and sought advice from experts in the field. He'd joined community organizations, participated in local discussions about gentrification and inclusion, and used his platform as a business owner to advocate for change. The financial impact of the changes had been overwhelmingly positive. Despite initial concerns about alienating existing customers, the restaurant had actually seen increased revenue and improved customer satisfaction scores. The more diverse customer base had proven to be loyal and engaged, and the improved staff culture had led to better service and lower turnover. "It turns out that inclusion is good for business," Harold had noted with some amazement. "When people feel welcome, they come back. When staff feel supported, they do better work. When you create a positive culture, everyone benefits." The changes had also extended beyond the restaurant itself. Harold had begun working with other business owners in the district, sharing his experience and encouraging similar transformations. He'd spoken at industry conferences, written articles about inclusive hospitality, and mentored other restaurant owners who were struggling with similar challenges. The incident with the Carter family was a wake-up call, he'd told a gathering of restaurant owners. "It made me realize that we have a responsibility to create spaces where everyone feels welcome, where everyone can experience the joy of good food and hospitality. It's not just about avoiding discrimination, it's about actively creating inclusion." The broader impact of the Carter family's experience had been significant. Their story had become a case study in how discrimination operates in everyday spaces, how institutions can change when confronted with their failures, and how individuals can make a difference by standing up for their dignity and rights. Jamal had been invited to speak at several business conferences, sharing their story and discussing the importance of inclusive practices. He'd been reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but he'd come to see it as an opportunity to create positive change. "We didn't set out to become activists," he'd told one audience. "We just wanted to have dinner with our children, but sometimes standing up for your basic dignity becomes a catalyst for broader change." Monique had joined the board of a local civil rights organization, lending her voice to conversations about discrimination in public accommodations. She'd helped develop training materials for businesses, worked with community groups to address ongoing challenges, and served as a resource for other families who'd experienced similar discrimination. "Change is possible," she'd told a community forum. "But it requires honest conversation, genuine commitment, and ongoing vigilance. The work is never finished." Aliyah had channeled her experience into her schoolwork, writing papers about discrimination and social justice, participating in student government, and organizing awareness campaigns. The incident had shaped her understanding of the world, but it had also reinforced her belief in the possibility of change. "I'm not going to accept discrimination as normal," she'd told her parents. "Our experience showed me that people can change, that institutions can change, that speaking up makes a difference." Even Malik, despite his young age, had been affected by the experience. He'd become more aware of fairness and unfairness, more sensitive to how people are treated differently, more committed to treating everyone with kindness and respect. "I don't want anyone to feel left out," he'd told his teacher during a class discussion about inclusion. "Everyone should get to be part of things." The transformation of Mitchell's Table had become a model for other businesses, a demonstration that change was possible when leaders were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to ongoing improvement. The restaurant had evolved from a symbol of exclusion to an example of inclusion, from a place where some people felt unwelcome to a space where everyone could experience dignity and respect. But the changes weren't without ongoing challenges. Creating an inclusive culture required constant attention, continuous learning, and a willingness to address problems as they emerged. There were still moments of tension, still instances where biases surfaced, still situations that required intervention and correction. Inclusion isn't a destination, Harold had come to understand. It's a journey, a daily commitment, a practice that requires constant attention and effort. The story of Mitchell's Table had become a story of redemption, of transformation, of the possibility of change. It had shown that individuals could grow, that institutions could evolve, and that communities could come together to address injustice and create something better. As the restaurant continued to thrive and grow, as its reputation for inclusive hospitality spread throughout the city, as its impact rippled through the industry and the community, the Carter family's experience had become a legacy of positive change. Their simple desire to share a meal had become a catalyst for transformation. Their refusal to accept discrimination had become an inspiration for others, and their story had become a testament to the power of speaking truth to power. The work continued, as it always must, but the foundation had been laid. Mitchell's Table had become more than a restaurant. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose inclusion over exclusion, when businesses prioritized dignity over discrimination, when communities committed to creating spaces where everyone could belong. The first anniversary of the Carter family's initial visit to Mitchell's Table arrived on a crisp October evening, marked not by protests or controversy, but by a quiet celebration of transformation. The restaurant had become a gathering place for the community, a symbol of what was possible when businesses committed to genuine inclusion. Harold Mitchell stood in the main dining room watching the evening service with a mixture of pride and ongoing commitment. The restaurant was busy, filled with the diverse mix of customers that had become its trademark. Families of all backgrounds shared meals, couples celebrated anniversaries, and business colleagues built relationships over excellent food and genuine hospitality. The Carter family had returned many times throughout the year, becoming regular customers and informal advisors on the restaurant's ongoing evolution. Their relationship with Harold had deepened from initial wariness to genuine friendship, based on shared commitment to creating positive change. "We never expected this," Monique had reflected during a recent visit. "We just wanted to be treated with respect, but it became something bigger, something that touched so many lives." The changes at Mitchell's Table had indeed rippled outward, inspiring other businesses in the district to examine their own practices, encouraging industry-wide conversations about inclusion, and contributing to a broader cultural shift toward more welcoming spaces. Emily Harper had found her place at a different restaurant, one that better matched her comfort level and expectations. The transition had been difficult but ultimately beneficial for everyone involved. Not everyone could make the journey toward inclusion, and that was a reality that Harold had learned to accept. Kyle had thrived in the new environment, becoming a trainer for new staff members and a vocal advocate for inclusive practices. His transformation had been genuine and lasting, proving that change was possible when people were willing to examine their assumptions and grow. Lisa had continued her rise within the organization, becoming a regional manager overseeing multiple locations as Harold expanded his business. Her leadership had been instrumental in ensuring that the commitment to inclusion spread throughout the growing enterprise. Zachary had been promoted to general manager, his experience and perspective proving invaluable in maintaining the restaurant's inclusive culture. His voice had become central to the ongoing conversation about hospitality and belonging. The broader community had also evolved. The district had become known for its commitment to inclusive business practices, attracting customers and businesses that shared those values. The neighborhood had found ways to balance growth with inclusion, progress with preservation of community values. As the evening wound down and the last customers finished their meals, Harold reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The confrontation with the Carter family had been painful, but it had also been transformative. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his business, his industry, and himself. The best thing that ever happened to this restaurant, he'd told Marcus during their most recent conversation, was being forced to look at ourselves honestly and commit to doing better. The story of Mitchell's Table had become a story of hope, of the possibility of change, of the power of individuals to create positive transformation. It had shown that discrimination could be confronted, that businesses could evolve, that communities could come together to create something better. The Carter family's experience had become a catalyst for broader change. Their courage in speaking up had inspired others to demand dignity, and their willingness to give second chances had demonstrated the possibility of redemption and growth. As the city settled into evening quiet, as the restaurant prepared for another day of serving its diverse community, as the ongoing work of inclusion continued, the legacy of that first difficult encounter remained a source of inspiration and commitment. Change was possible. Growth was achievable. Inclusion was not just an ideal but a practice, not just a goal but a daily commitment. Not just a destination, but a journey that required constant attention and effort. The work continued, as it always must, but the foundation had been laid. Mitchell's Table had become more than a restaurant. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, when businesses prioritized dignity over discrimination, when communities committed to creating spaces where everyone could belong. The story continued, as all good stories do, with the promise of tomorrow, the possibility of growth, and the ongoing commitment to treating every person who walked through the door with the respect and dignity they deserved. In the end, that was what it had always been about, the simple but profound belief that everyone deserved to be welcome, that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, that everyone deserved to belong. The Carter family's experience had reminded everyone involved of these fundamental truths, and the transformation of Mitchell's Table had become a living testament to their importance. The work of inclusion would never be finished, but it would continue, one conversation at a time, one interaction at a time, one family at a time. And in that ongoing commitment to growth and change, there was hope for a more just and inclusive future.